Blessings to you, beautiful soul. The angels have been waiting for this moment, the moment you would find this message. Their wings are surrounding you right now, wrapping around you with a warmth that goes beyond anything this physical world can create. And I want you to feel that, right now, before a single word more is spoken. Just take one slow breath and feel how held you are in this moment. Feel how seen you are. Feel how completely and unconditionally loved you are by forces that are always moving on your behalf, even when you cannot see them working. You are not here by accident. Heaven guided you to this message because there is something your heart has been quietly carrying, maybe for a long time now, and the angels have been trying to reach you with an answer. Today, that answer arrives. Welcome to Angel's message for you. Stay with me all the way through to the very end, because what I am about to share with you builds on itself, and the most important revelation of all is still to come. Do not leave before it reaches you. Let me ask you something. Have you been carrying a love in your heart that you cannot quite explain? A connection that refuses to go quiet no matter how much time passes or how much distance exists. A feeling that shows up in your dreams, in your thoughts, in the small quiet moments of your day when the noise of the world finally fades? If you are nodding right now, if something in your chest just moved, then this message was written for you. The angels see exactly what you have been living through, and they are here today to tell you the truth about what is happening. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop, because what you are about to receive is not just words. It is a spiritual confirmation of something your soul has known all along, but your mind has struggled to hold onto through all the uncertainty. This is heaven speaking directly to your heart. And heaven does not waste words. You are a protected soul. That is not just a phrase. It is a spiritual reality about who you are and how you move through this world. The love that you have been holding in your heart, the one that belongs to your soulmate, the one that has stayed with you even when everything around it went quiet, that love has not disappeared. It has not faded. It has not been forgotten by heaven or by the heart that placed it there. It has simply been moved to the safest place in all of existence. It has been placed in God's hands. Your soulmate, the one your soul recognizes even from a distance, the one whose presence you feel even when they are not physically near, the one who crosses your mind at moments that feel too specific to be coincidence, made a decision. A quiet decision, a deeply powerful decision that may have looked like pulling back, like stepping away, like silence. But the angels need you to understand the truth of what that decision actually was. It was not abandonment. It was not a lack of love. It was faith. Real, deep, spiritually mature faith. Your soulmate looked at the love you share, truly looked at it, felt the weight and the reality of it, and made the choice to entrust it to something greater than any human timeline could manage. Greater than circumstances, greater than pressure, greater than anything this imperfect world could throw in its path. This is not the end of a love story. This is the protection of one. And there is a profound difference. Think about what we do with the things we love most in this world. Think about the things that matter so deeply to us that the idea of losing them feels unbearable. We do not leave those things carelessly out in the open where anything could damage them. We protect them. We place them somewhere safe. We create the conditions where nothing harmful can reach them. Not until the right moment arrives, not until the time is truly ready for them to be lived fully and completely. That protective instinct, that impulse to guard what is most precious, that is exactly what your soulmate acted on. Not by holding on tighter and trying to control the outcome, but by releasing this love into the only hands capable of guarding it perfectly, into divine care. And in that sacred space, in the hands of the Creator, nothing can break this love. Nothing can steal it. Nothing can diminish it. No amount of time passing, no amount of silence, no amount of external confusion or worldly interference can touch what has been placed under heaven's protection. That is not poetic language. That is spiritual reality. When God holds something, it is held completely. Now I want to speak directly to something you may have been feeling, because the angels know it has been heavy. There was a shift at some point. Things became quieter. The connection that once felt constant and present started to feel more distant, more uncertain. Maybe the actions stopped. Maybe the words stopped. Maybe the space between you grew in a way that left you standing in the middle of it, asking, "Is it over? Did something change? Is the love I felt even real if it looks like this now?" The angels hear that question. They feel exactly how much weight it carries. They know the nights it kept you awake. They know the mornings you woke up and the first thought was the same heavy wondering all over again. And they are here today to answer that question directly and completely. No, it is not over. What you are reading as distance is not absence of love. What you are feeling as silence is not the end of the story. It is protection. It is divine care doing invisible work in a way that human eyes were never designed to track. True love does not vanish. It does not evaporate when circumstances get complicated. It does not dissolve when timing is difficult or when two people are both in the middle of their own growing and healing. Real love, the kind that is written into souls before it is ever spoken into words, is more like a root that lives deep beneath the earth than a flower that wilts when the weather changes. You cannot always see a root. You cannot always feel it doing its work. But it is alive. It is moving. It is preparing itself season by season for the moment when everything above the ground finally has what it needs to bloom. And when that bloom comes, it is not fragile. It is deeply rooted. It lasts. That is what is happening with this love. Right now, in the unseen, your soulmate still feels everything. This is something the angels need you to hold very close to your heart. The bond between you has not been severed. It is not weakened. This person still carries the same deep connection within, still moves toward you in the spiritual sense, still holds what you share in a place that is more protected now than it has ever been before. What links two souls at the level where heaven is involved cannot be undone by temporary circumstances, cannot be undone by human decisions made in complicated seasons. It cannot be undone by time or distance or silence. What was joined in the spiritual realm remains joined there regardless of what the surface of life looks like. And here is something beautiful for you to understand about the decision your soulmate made. When this love was placed in God's hands, it was not a form of giving up. It was not a door closing. It was surrender in the truest, most courageous sense of the word. The kind of surrender that says, I feel how precious this is. I feel how real this is. And precisely because I feel how real it is, I am not willing to risk destroying it by forcing it through timing that is not right yet. I trust something greater than my own impatience. I trust that the Creator can carry what I cannot carry alone in this season. Only someone who truly understands the value of love makes that kind of choice. Only someone who genuinely and deeply feels how sacred a connection is would reach past the instinct to hold on tightly and instead open their hands and say, I trust you with this, God. It takes enormous spiritual maturity to do that. It is not weakness dressed up in religious language. It is one of the strongest things a human heart can do. And your soulmate did it for this love, for what you share. So let that truth reshape how you have been seeing the silence. Do not read the quiet as absence. Do not read the distance as abandonment. Read it as reverence. Read it as a heart that loved deeply enough to protect what it felt rather than rush it into a moment that was not yet ready to hold it. The signs. Let us talk about the signs. Because you have been noticing them. Maybe you have been trying to talk yourself out of trusting them. Maybe you have been telling yourself it is just wishful thinking. Maybe you have been afraid to fully believe what you keep experiencing because believing feels risky. But the angels are asking you to stop doubting what your soul already knows. A song comes on at the exact moment your soulmate is in your thoughts. Not a random moment, not any song, but that specific one at that specific time. A thought arrives with no warning, detailed, familiar, unmistakably connected, and no ordinary explanation feels like enough to account for it. A dream where the presence is so real you wake up still feeling it, still sensing the warmth of it, still knowing something true just happened while you were sleeping. A moment in the middle of a perfectly ordinary day where a wave of feeling moves through you that has no logical source but is undeniably connected to this person. These things are not your imagination working overtime. They are not your longing dressing itself up as signs. They are real communications from the spiritual realm confirming that the bond is still alive and active. When love is entrusted to heaven, it does not disconnect from earth. It does not go cold or dark or silent in the way that human absence sometimes does. It simply moves to a different frequency, a more subtle one, a more spiritual one, felt through the soul rather than seen by the eyes, communicated through synchronicity and sensation rather than through words and actions. And those signs are heaven threading a constant reminder through your daily life. The connection is still here. The bond is still breathing. Keep trusting what your heart already knows even when your mind wants to argue against it. Your soulmate receives signs too. This is important. This person thinks of you, carries memories of you that surface at unexpected moments. Feels an inner pull in your direction even when nothing in the outer world is pointing toward you. True love does not require constant visible demonstration to exist between two people. It lives in the spiritual layer of things, in the frequency that two deeply connected souls share whether they are near each other or far. You feel it because it is genuinely real. You notice it because your soul is tuned to this connection in a way that goes far beyond ordinary logic or wishful thinking. You have been noticing these signs more clearly recently because something inside you is more open right now, more awake to what cannot be seen but is deeply, genuinely present. And that awakening is not a coincidence either. It is part of what begins to happen when something that was placed in heaven's care starts to move toward its moment of fulfillment. Your soul can feel the approach of what is coming even before your eyes have anything to show for it. There is a wisdom in waiting that the human heart finds enormously difficult to accept, especially a heart that loves as deeply and as sincerely as yours. We are wired for connection. We want closeness. We want to see things happen. We want answers now, movement now, confirmation now that what we feel is real and that it is building toward something. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that longing. It is human. It is honest. The angels do not judge it for 1 second. But heaven does not operate on urgency. Heaven is extraordinarily precise, but it is never rushed. And every single moment of silence, every stretch of waiting that felt like too much, every day where nothing seemed to move, none of it was wasted. All of it was preparing something within you, something within your soulmate, something between you that could not have been fully built while both hearts were still carrying what they were carrying when this season began. God does not unite two souls while both are still in the middle of breaking open. He works in each person first. He goes into the tender places, the places that hurt, the places that were shaped by old wounds and old patterns and old fears, and he heals them. He restores what was cracked. He teaches each soul how to love more freely, more clearly, more consciously than they ever have before. And that work is never quick. It is deep. It is quiet. It is invisible to anyone watching from the outside. But it is the most important work of all, because it is the work that makes everything that comes after it last. Think about a seed. A small, seemingly dormant seed that has been moved from shallow, rocky soil into a protected space. A greenhouse, a place with the right warmth and the right nourishment and the right conditions for real growth. From the outside, looking at that greenhouse day after day, you would see almost nothing changing. The ground looks still. There is no visible green, no sign of life pushing upward. A person who did not understand what was happening underground might look at it and conclude that nothing was growing. But underground, everything is happening. Every single day those roots are going deeper. Every day the seed is becoming something more capable of standing strong when the storms arrive. Every day what is being built inside that protected space is becoming more real, more solid, more permanent than anything that could have been rushed into existence before the roots were ready. When the moment finally comes to bring that growth into the open world, it does not arrive as something fragile and easily damaged by the first wind that comes along. It arrives as something rooted, something built to last, something that has the depth beneath it to hold what is placed on top of it. That is this love story. That is exactly what is happening right now in the unseen space between you and your soulmate. Do not look at the stillness on the surface and decide nothing is growing. The stillness is protecting something extraordinary. Your soulmate made a courageous choice, not the kind of courage that announces itself loudly, that demands recognition, that makes a scene. The quiet kind, the deeply internal kind, the kind that understands that sometimes the most powerful act of love is not holding on tightly but releasing your grip on controlling the outcome and trusting that a wiser, more capable, more loving set of hands can carry what you love forward more safely than you can in this moment. Your soulmate recognized, really recognized, in that deep way that changes a person, that pushing this love through in human timing, forcing it through circumstances that were not aligned, letting anxiety and impatience drive the story, would only create pressure that this connection was not built to survive right now. And so instead of grasping, instead of insisting, instead of letting fear make the decisions, your soulmate did what only a spiritually mature heart is capable of doing. They stepped back. They breathed. They trusted. They handed this love to the Creator and said, "Take care of this. I know you will. I know this is too precious to leave anywhere else." That act of trust, that moment of surrender, opened something in the spiritual realm. It created space for God to step in as the active guardian of this connection. And when heaven guards something, nothing in this world has the authority or the power to erase it. No human pain can reach it. No fear can diminish it. No amount of time passing can make it disappear. What is kept under divine protection is kept completely. This is not a story of two people who lost their way. This is the story of two souls being individually, lovingly, carefully prepared for what they share to finally become everything it was always written to be. Your soulmate is going through a transformation too. Even now, even in the quiet, even at a distance, this person is being shaped and guided by the same divine hand that is working in you right now. The same process, the same patient, purposeful, unstoppable preparation. And here is something the angels want to highlight for you, because it matters so much. When love tries to live in a heart that has not yet found its own peace, when two people try to build something together while both are still in the middle of their wounds, that love gets weighed down. It gets tangled in old patterns, in fears that have nothing to do with the present moment, in insecurities that belong to the past and not to the truth of what is between them. Love under those conditions struggles. It misreads things. It overreacts. It collapses under pressures it should be able to carry because its foundation is not finished yet. But when both hearts are given real time and space to be healed, when both souls move through their own individual restoration, their own reckoning, their own growth, the love they bring back to each other is completely different from what they carried before. It is deeper. It is more patient. It is more honest. It sees more clearly. It holds more steadily. It is built on ground that does not shift when things get hard. That is the love that is being prepared for you right now. Not just for you to receive, for both of you to bring to each other. Love that has been through the fire and come out refined. Love that knows its own value because it survived the waiting. Love that will not be easily shaken because both of the hearts inside it have been made more whole. You may be feeling something these days that is difficult to put into words. A kind of inner shift that you did not plan for and did not choose, but that arrived anyway. A mix of longing and peace existing in the same space at the same time, which makes no ordinary sense but is undeniably there. Something rising in you without a clear external reason. Not quite hope and not quite certainty, but something in between. Something that feels like the very beginning of something real beginning to move. The angels call this preparation. Your soul is being made ready to receive what has been kept safe for you. Not forced into readiness. Not pushed before the timing is right. Just quietly, gently, naturally becoming the version of yourself that is fully capable of holding what is coming. And that is a sacred feeling to carry. When heaven breathes that kind of shift into a person, it means the distance between where you are and where you are going has been closing. Something is drawing near. Not in the anxious, urgent way, in the divine way. The way a flower opens not because someone pulls at the petals and forces it open, but because every condition finally came into perfect alignment and opening became the most natural thing in the world. You have already done the hardest part of this journey. You have held on through confusion. You have kept believing through silence. You have kept your heart open through the seasons when closing it and walking away would have felt so much easier and so much safer. And heaven has been watching every single moment of that faithfulness. Every prayer you sent upward in the quiet was received. Every honest conversation you had with God in the middle of a difficult night was heard and held with care. Every tear that fell when no one was watching was witnessed from above with something that can only be described as tender, grateful admiration. Because loving the way you have loved, with patience, with surrender, with a heart that stayed open even when it was tired and uncertain, is not common. It is not ordinary. It is the kind of love that heaven honors, because it reflects something of what heaven itself is made of. Now hear this truth and let it settle all the way in. The love between you and your soulmate has been consecrated in the unseen. It was recognized by the divine as something genuine, something pure, something worthy of being protected and kept. God does not receive love like this into his care and leave it sitting untouched. He transforms it. He strengthens it in ways that no human process could replicate. He refines it, burning away the parts that were fear-based, the parts that were insecurity-based, the parts that were built on need rather than on genuine, clear, conscious love. And what remains after that refining process is extraordinary. It is the truest version of what was always there beneath the layers. And when the time comes to release it back into the world, it does not return the same way it was given. It returns healed. It returns whole. It returns carrying a depth and a clarity and a solidity that simply was not possible before this season of being held and worked on by divine hands. That time is drawing closer than you think. You may not see it yet with your physical eyes. The outer world may still look unchanged. But pay attention to what is happening inside you. The peace that arrives unexpectedly in moments that should feel painful, that is not nothing. That is God quietly confirming that things are being taken care of. The hope that keeps returning even when your logical mind builds arguments against it, that is not wishful thinking. That is heaven holding up a light and saying, stay with this, what belongs to you has not been canceled. It is still coming, it is still being prepared. Your soulmate is receiving the same inner signals. This person is being pointed in your direction even in the quiet seasons, even when nothing on the surface reflects it. Even if the outer paths still look separate right now, something is aligning in the deep place where real connections live and breathe and grow. And when two souls that are bound together by something written into them before they were born are both being prepared for the same moment, the meeting of those two paths is not a question of if. It was never a question of if. It is only a question of when. And heaven's when is always exactly right. God's timing does not follow a schedule that fits inside human understanding. It does not respond to urgency. It cannot be hurried by worry or effort or any amount of human insistence. But it is not careless. It is not vague or indifferent. It is precise in a way that human timing never could be, because it accounts for everything. The healing that still needs to happen, the inner work that is still in progress, the shifts in both hearts that must complete before the outer reality can change to match them. While it seems from the outside like nothing is moving, everything is being worked on in the unseen. Not at the speed our eyes would choose, but at the depth that something lasting requires. And what is built at that depth does not fall apart when life gets complicated. It does not fray at the edges when pressure comes. It holds. There are things within you that are still being healed. There are things within your soulmate that are still being restored. Cycles that needed to close are closing. Old wounds that had to be treated before they could stop influencing everything are being treated. Fears that once had the power to make love collapse are being dissolved. And all of that takes time that cannot be rushed without damaging the result. But it is not wasted time. It is invested time. Time that is building the foundation of something that will last not just for a season, but for the long arc of both your lives. Do not confuse the quiet with abandonment. Do not mistake the invisible work of heaven for nothing happening. Seeds do not announce their growth. And some of the most important and most miraculous work in all of creation takes place in complete silence, underground, out of sight, unstoppable and full of purpose. Every single day that felt empty was building something. Every night you lay awake missing your soulmate, every moment of wondering and not knowing, every prayer spoken into the dark when the morning still felt far away, all of it was serving a purpose greater than the pain of the moment. You were learning. You were growing. You were becoming someone more capable of receiving and sustaining what is coming. And your soulmate has been on their own version of that same journey. The spiritual connection between you is still fully alive. The bond is being restored, not by human effort, not by anyone forcing anything into happening before its time, but by divine direction, by the quiet, steady, faithful movement of heaven doing exactly what it has always promised to do with love that is surrendered to it with a genuine and trusting heart. The promises made in the unseen, even the ones that were never spoken aloud, even the ones made only in the private conversation between a soul and God, those promises are real. They are held in a place where they cannot be forgotten or lost or taken away. And they are finding room to begin manifesting, not through human pressure, through destiny, through the alignment that happens when everything that needed to be prepared has finally been prepared. And you will know it when you feel a peace inside you that does not depend on having all the answers. A peace that simply exists, steady and clear, alongside whatever else you are feeling. That peace is already beginning to move into you. And it is the first sign that what was promised is on its way. Keep your heart steady. That is the invitation the angels are placing before you today. Not the kind of steady that means turning off your emotions or pretending the longing is not real. Not the kind that means hardening yourself against hope because hope has felt too risky. The kind of steady that means rooted, anchored in something that does not move even when everything on the surface shifts. Trusting in something you cannot always see clearly but have learned, through everything this season has asked of you, to genuinely believe in. Do not rush what is being built with such extraordinary, deliberate care. Do not mistake God's silence for his absence. Do not look at the waiting and call it a permanent ending when heaven is calling it a preparation. What is true always returns. It always finds its way back to where it belongs. And what is true between you and your soulmate has not been lost. It has only been placed in the one space that is safer and more capable of holding it than anything human hands could have constructed. Take care of your own soul through this, not just for the sake of what is coming, but because you are worth that care right now, today, independent of any other outcome. Keep listening to your intuition. Keep noticing the signs when they appear. Keep your heart soft and open and willing to believe in what it feels, even when the outer world has not yet caught up to the inner truth. Because real faith does not live on visible proof. It lives in the steady inner knowing that God is in control, that he sees everything, that he is actively guiding and protecting and preparing and restoring everything that already belongs to you by the truth of your soul. This message found you today because heaven has seen your heart. Everything shared here is not a guess or a prediction. It is a confirmation of what is already being done in the spiritual realm on your behalf. Your role now is to remain in peace, to receive this truth with gratitude, to keep caring for yourself with the same love and tenderness you have given so freely to this connection. Because what is coming was not born from your effort or your insistence. It was born from God's faithfulness. And God does not fail those who trust. The love you entrusted to heaven is returning, not as a memory, not as a repeat of what was difficult or incomplete. It is coming back with purpose and with a wholeness that could only have been created through exactly this kind of season, this kind of deep, patient, faithful growing in the unseen. And everything you felt while receiving this message today is only the beginning of what heaven is still preparing to show you. You are deeply loved. You are watched over. You are never walking this path alone, not for a single step of it. The light around you is real. The love being held for you is real. And what is meant for you is already, right now, finding its way home to you. May the angels bless your heart today and every single day. May peace walk with you through every moment of the waiting. May you feel settled in the deepest place inside you that everything is going to be more than okay. Because it is, truly is. And it is going to be more beautiful than anything you have yet been able to imagine. There is one more thing the angels want to say before this message closes. Because it is perhaps the most personal and the most tender of everything that has been shared today. Heaven knows how many times you have wondered if you were wrong to believe in this. How many times the logical part of your mind stepped in and said, maybe I am making too much out of nothing. Maybe the signs I am seeing are just what I want to see. Maybe I have been holding on to something that is not really there anymore. Maybe it is time to stop believing and just accept that this chapter is finished. The angels want you to know they heard every single one of those moments, every doubt, every late night where the questions were louder than the peace. Every morning where you had to make a deliberate choice to keep the faith alive because it did not feel like it was keeping itself alive on its own. They heard it, they saw it, and they want you to know that none of those moments of doubt made them love you less or believe in this story any less. Because doubt is not the opposite of faith. Doubt is what happens when human hearts are asked to trust in what they cannot yet fully see. And the fact that you kept choosing to trust anyway, that is not weakness. That is one of the most beautiful things a soul can do. You did not give up. Through everything this season has asked of you, through every moment where giving up would have been understandable, you held on. You kept your heart open. You kept reaching towards something you could feel but could not always see. And that faithfulness, that choosing day after day to believe, has not gone unnoticed by heaven. It has been counted. It has been honored. And it is part of what is making the return of this love possible. Because here is something that matters deeply. What comes back to you will be shaped, in part, by how you held the waiting, by what you grew into during this season, by who you became while you were trusting rather than forcing. And what you grew into during this time is remarkable. You became someone more patient, more spiritually aware, more capable of recognizing the difference between love that is built on need and love that is built on truth. And that difference is everything. The person who receives what is coming is not the same person who entered this waiting season. You are more ready now than you have ever been. And the love that is returning is meeting a version of you that can truly hold it. Think for a moment about all the times in your life when something that felt like a loss or a delay or a setback ended up being a protection. Think about the times when what you thought you wanted and thought you were losing turned out to be something that was being redirected rather than removed. Think about how many times heaven said not yet when you were asking for now, and how it eventually became clear that the not yet was an act of extraordinary love. This is one of those times. The waiting you are in right now, the silence you have been moving through, the questions that have been living in you without answers. All of it is a not yet that is rooted in love, in divine wisdom, in a care for your well-being and the well-being of your soulmate that goes so far beyond what either of you could have arranged for yourselves. God is not withholding. God is preparing. There is a critical difference between those two things, and the angels want that difference to live in you like a steady light from this day forward. When you feel the ache of the waiting, when the longing rises and the questions come back to this truth. Not withheld, prepared, not forgotten, protected, not over, being made ready. Your soulmate is being touched by the same truths. Right now, even without a word between you, even without any visible sign of movement, something is shifting in this person's heart too. The spiritual connection you share is sending what it sends to both of you. The preparation that heaven is doing is happening in both of you simultaneously, at whatever pace each one needs, moving toward the same moment from two different directions. And that moment, the moment when what has been prepared in the unseen begins to make itself known in the visible, that moment is being carefully set in motion. Not randomly, not accidentally, with the same precision and the same love and the same attentiveness to every detail that has characterized everything else heaven has done in this story. When it comes, you will not need to force anything into place. You will not need to convince anyone of anything or make anything happen through effort or pressure. You will simply find that things that were not aligned begin to align. Doors that were closed begin to open. Conversations that needed to happen become possible. Understanding that was not available before becomes available. Peace that had not been present before fills the space between you, and you will recognize it, not because it looks exactly like what you imagined, but because it feels like what your soul has always known this was supposed to become. Do not build a picture in your mind of exactly how this must arrive and exactly what it must look like. Let heaven show you. Let the Creator bring this forward in the way that is best and most true and most lasting, rather than the way that your imagination constructed during the waiting. Because what heaven has planned is almost always more beautiful than what we were able to picture for ourselves while we were standing inside the uncertainty. So receive this message today with open hands. Receive it not as something you need to analyze or verify or argue with, but as something your soul is already recognizing. The truth always resonates in a particular way, not with noise, but with a quiet settling, a sense of something landing that was always supposed to land. If you felt that while reading any part of what was shared here today, trust it. That settling is your soul confirming what heaven is saying. And carry this with you, not just today, but into every moment that comes after this one. Into the days that feel easy and the days that still feel heavy. Into the mornings full of hope and the nights still full of questions. Into every moment between now and when everything the angels have spoken of today becomes fully visible in your life. You are loved beyond what language can hold. You are protected in ways you will not fully understand until you can look back on this season from the other side of it. You are never, not for a single breath, left to carry any of this alone. Heaven is with you. The angels are with you. The love that has been placed in God's hands is safe, and it is on its way back to you. Stay in faith. Stay in peace. Stay soft and open and willing to receive, because everything that is true about this love is about to become everything that is visible about it. And when it does, you will understand exactly why every moment of the waiting was worth it. With infinite love and endless light, your angels are with you always. Amen. And so it is.